Okay, members, we're going to bring the committee to order. We do have a quorum, and Representative Lewick, you've had a chance to review the minutes.
Yes, sir.
Representative Lewick moves the minutes from the, let's see, what was the day on the minutes?
13th.
January 13th. All in favor of approving the minutes, signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, motion prevails. The minutes are adopted. Members, I apologize for, and the audience, members of the public, I apologize for getting started a little late. We have a few technical issues we were trying to straighten out. But to start with, the hearing is about informational hearing only on the wolf situation in Minnesota with the judge's decision that took place. I think a lot of people are wondering where we're at now. Where have we been? Where are we at now, and what do we expect? So we tried to bring some folks together to answer some of those questions for us. So we have a number of people that are going to be presenting, and we're going to start with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Mr. Dan Stark, I think he's going to start. You want to come forward? Members, this is an informational hearing, and we've invited some folks in that we thought could give us the best perspective on the facts about what's happening, and I think pretty much the entire hearing is going to be taken up by that. If we have time left, we will bring some folks up that have called over the weekend. They left some voicemails, and we've called those folks back. And if we have time for them to testify at the end, we will do that. But I'm pretty sure that the entire committee hearing is going to be taken up with the people that we've invited in. So, are we ready to start? Mr. Bogus, welcome to the committee.
Yes, Mr. Chair and members, thank you. I'm Ed Bogus. I'm the Director of Fish and Wildlife for the Department of Natural Resources. I do have with me Mr. Dan Stark, who is our large carnivore specialist, stationed in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, and works on our bear and wolf programs. And I just would briefly say that Minnesota has a wolf management plan that's been in effect for the last 15 years or so that has guided our wolf management, whether wolves were on the federal endangered species and threatened list or not, and that plan gives us good guidance going forward. This isn't the first time that we've been in the situation that we're in right now. And so what we thought we would do today is we have a handout that I think is in all of your packets that Mr. Stark is going to walk through that gives a little bit of what the chairman was referencing in terms of where we've been, where we currently are now, and kind of what some of the next steps related to wolf management in Minnesota might be. So we'll go through that, and then if there's time for questions, Mr. Chair, we'll try to respond to those at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Bogus. Mr. Stark.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee.
You might want to, just for the record, state who you are and who you represent.
My name is Dan Stark. I'm the large carnivore specialist for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources.
Thank you. That's just for the tape. Thank you.
And I'm going to give a brief overview of wolf management, primarily related to state management. But first, a little bit of background. Wolves were unprotected in Minnesota until they were listed as an endangered species in 1974. The federal recovery plan that was adopted in 1992 had a recovery goal of at least 1,251 to 1,400 wolves to assure the recovery of the wolf in Minnesota. And the Minnesota Wolf Management Plan has a goal of at least 1,600 wolves, which is a minimum statewide population goal. It's not a management objective. We're not trying to reduce the wolf population to that level. It is a threshold in which if the population was ever at or approaching that level, we would want to reverse whatever trend is causing that and maintain a population above that level. The wolf population in Minnesota has fully recovered. It has exceeded those goals for quite some time, a couple of decades at least. And there's really no reason to think that we would approach that level for any reason unless some significant threat occurred to the population. The Fish and Wildlife Service has published 3 final rules to remove endangered species protections for wolves in Minnesota since 2007. And those were in effect for different periods of time. Initially, the wolf was removed from the endangered species list from a period of about 18 months in March of 2007 until September of 2008. Then again in May of 2009 through June of 2009, so a 2-month period. And then most recently in January of 2012, the wolf was removed from the endangered species list for about 3 years until the recent court ruling, which put them back on the list in December of 2014. In regards to the federal court ruling, this returned the endangered species protections for wolves in Minnesota. The legal status lists them as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And so wolves basically cannot be killed for any reason except in the defense of human life. There are some provisions to allow wolves to be taken for depredation control. And we do have that flexibility, whereas in Wisconsin and Michigan, they don't. They're fully endangered. The core issue of the judge's ruling was that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service can't delist a distinct population segment from a species listing unless a species was first listed as that category of a distinct population segment. And that wolves have not recovered throughout much of their historic range. So the wolf is listed throughout the lower 48 states as endangered, except Minnesota, where they're listed as a threatened species, which allows us that management flexibility. During the periods of time that the wolf has been delisted under federal rule, we've implemented our state wolf management plan. That's included a depredation management program to address conflicts with wolves and livestock. It also includes provisions for individuals to kill wolves under state law where they're a threat to livestock or pets. We also implemented the first wolf season in 2012, and that was the first regulated hunting and trapping season for wolves in Minnesota in the history of the state. We also implemented seasons in the following 2 years, 2013 and 14. We conduct annual monitoring of the wolf population, and it includes winter track surveys, carnivore scent station surveys. More recently, we've been implementing an annual population survey. Those had previously been done at periodic level or intervals, but we do evaluate the population status each year. Last winter, we completed a population survey and estimated the population to be about 2,423 wolves. That population estimate has a confidence interval from 1,935 to 2,947 wolves. These estimates are done in the winter months when the population is the most stable, but also at the lowest point of its annual cycle. It's the easiest time of the year to count wolves because they're more visible based on the conditions. There's snow on the ground, no tree canopy, so we can observe wolves during that time. This population estimate was 200 more than the previous estimate from the winter of 2012 and 13. We estimated there were 470 packs in the state. They have an average territory size of about 50 square miles and an average pack size of 4.4. We're also conducting another survey this winter, and those survey results will be available later this spring, early summer. On the handout, there's a map of the state with the range of the wolf over these different surveys. These surveys, as I had mentioned, had been conducted initially at 10-year intervals, more recently at every 5 years, and the last couple of winters we've been doing a population estimate each winter. Most recently, the wolf range is defined by that outer boundary, including the yellow shaded area. In Minnesota, we've had a pretty active depredation management program going back to the mid-1970s. When wolves were classified as threatened in 1978, it allowed wolves to be trapped and killed where there was conflicts with livestock. We've continued that program under state management through a cooperative agreement with the USDA Wildlife Services Agency. Our conservation officers have been the primary agents involved in investigating depredation claims, and in addition to under state management, in addition to Wildlife Services trapping wolves, we also have a state certified trapping program where we allow individuals to go through training to be certified to trap wolves where there's depredation conflicts. And currently we have about 100 state certified trappers that are available if once a wolf is removed from the endangered species list to resume those types of activities. In 2014, we had a total of 172 wolves that were trapped by USDA Wildlife Services, 39 by certified wolf trappers, and then 7 wolves shot legally by individuals to protect livestock or pets. Compared to previous years, in 2012, we had about 295 wolves that were killed for depredation conflicts. And last year we had about 130, or in 2013, we had about 130. The compensation claims are paid by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and that program's administered through that agency. The 2014 wolf season consisted of an early hunting season and then a late hunting and trapping season. The early season coincides with our firearms deer season. The late season starts November 29th and was scheduled to run through January 31st or until the target harvests were met. We had initially established a target harvest of 250 wolves. This is still considered a conservative level of wolf take and is not intended to have a negative long-term influence on the wolf population. The target harvest is the primary mechanism which is used to close the wolf season. Unlike other seasons where we sell licenses and have set season dates, the wolf season is limited by this target harvest, and we are able to close the season when we're at or approaching that level. We had 3,800 licenses offered in the 2014 season, and about 15,000 people applied. We had sold a total of 3,920 licenses, and those include licenses that are available for military members. This year we had a total of 272 wolves harvested over both seasons. In the early season, this was the first year where we closed the season during the firearms deer season. We reached the target harvest, and that hasn't happened in the previous 2 years during the early season. The late season closed after 13 days, which is less than half the time that it took in the previous season. The next steps, primarily in regard to the wolf being removed from the federal endangered species list. We still haven't heard if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will be appealing that decision, but they have until February 17th to make that decision. There's also been some recent information that there could be a possibility of federal legislation similar to what occurred in Montana and Idaho, which removed endangered species protections in that area. And in regards to wolf damage control, how that will be funded is unclear. We support reinstatement of federal funding while the wolf is listed under the endangered species list. And that's all the information I have.
Okay. Thank you very much. Members will take questions. Representative Russo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you tell me on the map, how are the limits of the ranges defined?
Mr. Stark.
Mr. Chair and Representative Russo, the wolf population range is estimated based on surveys of our natural resource staff. So we send out, over the winter months, and send out a survey and ask them to report information on where they see wolves and sign of wolves. And based on that information of an occupied area, and consistent observations of wolves in that area, we use that to define this line.
Thank you.
Representative Russo.
Thank you. Of the 3,800 licenses that were offered, it says that only 3,433 were sold, but you had 15,000 people applying for them. Why weren't all of them sold?
Mr. Stark.
Mr. Chair and Representative Russo, there's actually an error in that line. In the bullet, it says there are 3,800 licenses offered and a total of 3,433 licenses sold. The actual number is found in the table below where it says there were 3,920 licenses issued. So we did sell all the licenses, and there's 120 more than what was offered in the initial lottery because we have a provision that allows military members to purchase license or to get a license for free, and they aren't required to enter the lottery.
Representative Russo.
Thank you. And then you consistently, the harvest is a little bit over the target, and I understand that's because of, the mechanics of closing the season, but we went about 10% over the target in this last season. Is that expected? Is that built into the targets, or is that a little bit more than you had anticipated?
Mr. Stark.
Mr. Chair, Representative Russo, it's not built into the target harvest, but it's not a level that would cause any threat to the population or a negative impact on the population. Each year we've had a little bit different progression of the season towards the end. And this year, on the day that we closed the season, we had initiated the closure for the northwest zone when we were about 12 wolves short of the target harvest for that zone. We had 32 wolves registered that day, which is the most we've had any day of any season, and went quite a bit over the limit for that day, which was more than what we expected. But it's the average for the season is primarily what we base the closure on, and we had been averaging about 12 wolves a day being registered, and we ended up having 32 the last day.
Representative Russo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we confident that people are actually registering their kills on the day they do it, or are people holding back?
Mr. Chair, Representative Russo, I don't have any information that would indicate they're holding them back. I don't think there's anything that's been documented that would suggest that. But I think it does indicate we should review the closure procedure and maybe anticipate it under different circumstances, or perhaps, as you mentioned, allow for some consideration of building that into the target harvest.
Thank you.
Okay. Representative Lewick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gosh, we've been at this a long time, gentlemen, haven't we? Couple questions. First of all, I haven't heard anything yet that outlines the cost to the citizens of Minnesota, both in the Department of Natural Resources on an annual basis and the Department of Agriculture. I think it's important that folks realize that the taxpayers here in Minnesota have invested hugely in this, and are particularly interested in what the impact will be on revenue if we're not allowed to have a wolf hunt in the next year. That obviously could be a problem. And then a second question, and then I'll shut up here. Also, a little insight into the impact if we can't utilize our our private sector trappers, who we took a long time to train and get up to speed, if we lose their expertise for a year or two, if this thing drags out, what's your analysis on the impact of rebuilding that cadre of people?
Mr. Stark?
Mr. Chair and Representative Lewick, the cost, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we can get you that information and make it available. In regards to training our state-certified wolf trappers, it's been a program that's been in place on and off since 2007, and it's currently on hold until the status is resolved. But you know, whether the interest continues or not, I think it'll be up to the individuals, but certainly we would reinstate them in the program once we have that authority to do so, and provide a refresher opportunity to get them trained or familiar with the program again. Of the 100 that are certified, certainly not all of them have been active in the program. There's probably only 20 to 30 that regularly have been involved in some of the trapping.
Mr. Chair, if I could, could you just give folks maybe a general order of magnitude? I could take a stab at how many full-time equivalent positions are directly related to dealing with the wolf management. Could you give us just an order? Maybe Mr. Bogus could give us a little perspective. We're not talking about Mr. Stark here by himself. We're talking about game wardens and some other folks. Just some general order of magnitude, because I think the folks out there should have an opportunity to get an idea of just how much the state of Minnesota has invested in this for the last couple decades.
Mr. Bogus?
Mr. Chair and Representative Lewick, you know, it'll be an order of magnitude, like you say. It won't be an exact figure, but I would just start out by saying that after we did the wolf management plan, and Representative Lewick at that time representing the cattle producers was actually on our wolf roundtable back in the 90s, where we had all the potentially affected interests, from the wolf advocates to the hunters, to the trappers, to the livestock, various livestock interests, the bands, and we attempted to bring everyone together to come up with a plan that would work for the state of Minnesota. And we certainly have been working on this a long time, but as part of that implementation of that plan, portions of it didn't require us to wait for delisting. We thought delisting was imminent at that time, because it required not only, as Mr. Stark had mentioned, it required not only that Minnesota's population objectives be met, which happened around 1990 or so, but also that there be another population outside the state before the federal criteria could be met, which didn't happen until the late 1990s. But that's when we did the roundtable and put together the plan, which ultimately the legislation to support that plan passed in 2000. The plan was finalized in 2001, and we did have several provisions in there to increase the Department of Natural Resources' ability to manage wolves, including hiring Mr. Stark, hiring a wolf researcher. There were recommendations on hiring conservation officers, which we didn't specifically get an appropriation for. We did come to the legislature and get appropriations to add these wolf management positions and supporting funding for surveys and research. And all of that, enforcement got an increase through a general fund appropriation that wasn't directly related to wolves, and they've since, you know, gone kind of backwards in that arena. But all of that was in the neighborhood of about $400,000 a year for the last 10 years. So, and then in recent years, there's been revenue from wolf licenses and applications, of course, that's been about in the range of, I think, $150,000 to $200,000 a year. And there's also been revenue out of all the deer licenses. It wasn't additional revenue, but it was earmarked revenue out of the deer licenses of 50 cents per deer license. That revenue will continue unless the legislature changes that, but the wolf revenue obviously is going to disappear. We've since delisting, the federal funding for wolf damage control by Wildlife Services was cut actually prior to delisting as part of the elimination of earmarks in the federal budget. And that was $700 and some thousand for the Western Great Lakes in total, including Wisconsin and Michigan. That has never been reinstated. That federal money has never been reinstated, and Minnesota DNR has contracted with Wildlife Services, as Mr. Stark said, since delisting for about 8 months out of the year, 7, 8 months out of the year. During the peak of the depredation season is April to October. There's not a lot in the winter when the cattle are in closer, and sheep and so forth. But we've been paying about $200,000 a year to Wildlife Services for the past 3 years for a cooperative service agreement, which, as Mr. Stark indicated, we no longer feel that's appropriate to come out of our state funds, and we're going to need to find an alternative way to continue that program.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions of the Department of Natural Resources? We're going to bring the Department of Ag up next if there's no further questions. Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to have Minnesota Department of Agriculture, Mr. Cruz. Before we get started again, I'd like to, we finally got our permanent pages. If our pages could come up and just introduce yourselves to the microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I'm Barb Smith, and hopefully I'm here forever. Well, as long as
My name is Patrick Levine.
Welcome to the committee. Thank you for helping.
Chair Hackworth, thank you for the invitation. My name is Sandro Cruz, the Director of Government Affairs for the Department of Agriculture here in Minnesota, and I do not want to be here forever today. I have with me Mr. Blaine White, who will be taking over in a moment. Again, I'd like to say thank you for the invitation to the Department of Ag to come here and testify today, specifically on the historical backdrop of the wolf and elk depredation accounts, which is a compensation fund run through the department. I will add, as far as context goes, given the where we are at in the session, there are certain questions this committee may well have, very reasonable questions, but because the governor's budget has not come out, that's next week, we may not be in a position to answer it, only because we're not allowed to comment on what we've proposed to the governor or what the governor will in fact approve. However, you can be rest assured that we are huge supporters of our livestock farmers, and we feel their pain very, very real. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Blaine White, who runs the wolf and elk depredation account, to give you some backdrop there. You should have in your packets a very boring looking set of numbers that we're going to walk through, not line by line, but in conceptual and historical backdrop. And then we will both stand for questions that the committee may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Thank you. Please state your name and who you represent for the record.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Blaine White, Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I'm the program coordinator for the wildlife compensation program we have that compensates farmers for losses of livestock to wolves and crop and fence damage due to elk.
Thank you. Welcome to the committee.
I'm here today mainly to give you just a very brief history of the status and an update of the current status of the program. In the mid-1970s, as you know, when the Endangered Species Act was passed, the wolves were listed. The legislature in Minnesota responded in 1977, passing legislation setting up a program and process where farmers could be reimbursed for livestock lost to wolves. Mainly because when wolves were listed, they lost the ability to defend their livestock. Since that time, there have been changes to the process, and the program has expanded a little, but it continues. Crop damage due to elk was added in 1987, and fence damage from elk was added in 2011. And the very brief overview is as the wolf population has expanded and you've heard is recovered, the number of farms experiencing depredation continues to increase as the wolves spread over larger areas of the state and well into the agricultural areas. Along with this current situation, the value of cattle in particular has increased this year as farmers across the nation are rebuilding their herds after the recent drought. As a result, we have exhausted all available funds and have about 31 claims that we are unable to pay. We are in the process of notifying farmers that their claims cannot be paid, and our letter will also inform them of the new federal livestock indemnity program that they may be able to file a claim under. That's
Mr. Chair.
the end of my prepared remarks.
Representative Cornish.
Mr. Chair, if I could make a few comments here, but in case I have to leave early to another meeting about this. I was a game warden in northern Minnesota for 20 years in the wolf area and got to walk some of the area with, I think, Dr. or Professor Meach back there? Yeah. The wolf expert. At any rate, when I got to the station, I had a whole drawer full of bounty forms that they paid for the killing of wolves in the 70s. And it changed over to claim forms when they started protecting them, and then that filled the other part of the drawer, and it was a terrible process to go through, very political it seemed like, because you couldn't prove a lot of times that the cattle were killed by endangered species. And if you didn't find tracks or scat or something like that, and the farmer wasn't, even though there was a loss estimate, it wasn't enough. And if you could claim it, because sometimes the cattle would go out, even pregnancy tested, you know they had a calf and they'd come back without it, but without something completely missing, I couldn't claim it. And so now you're really at risk. I mean, the shoot, shovel, and shut up that they used to have when they took care of their own problems, now, without getting paid for it, I fear that we're gonna go back into that. And it was a real mess to take care of at that time. So. I just wondered if you were worried about the same thing. Plus, there was a failure to prosecute because they didn't think you could get jury to convict them. So there were 3 prosecutions that I had to go out and investigate. 2 farmers that shot wolves and another person that was hunting grouse shot one dead. And the federal warden basically told me, I don't think I can get a conviction out of the people in the jury, and so they took administrative fine instead. So I really worry about this lack of payment, lack of hunting season, trapping season, no control, to going back to the old method of taking care of the problems by yourself. And I was wondering if you're worried about that too.
Mr. Cruz.
Mr. Chair and members, certainly there are concerns about just the logistics, and in this situation where we have 31 claims that have not been paid and the funds have been exhausted, that's a huge concern for us. However, this is the first time that's happened. We have had a good process in the past. We are not the parties that go out and investigate those claims, so I couldn't speak to some of the historical things you're talking about there, but certainly I have heard those same concerns from people more experienced than myself in the investigations. So we'd turn it over to the committee for other questions. Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, the only last
Cornish.
comment that I've made is that you gave people some control of their own destiny, the protection of their livestock. And yes, you got that old argument about, well, they're wintering them out where they shouldn't be, but try to tell a farmer, you know, you can't have a business. So I just worry we're going to get back into that same mood now that you've taken, and a lot of it was mental. The farmers I knew, there was hardly a one of them that wanted the wolf eliminated. They respected a lot of them, but they just wanted to control their own future and their business. So that's all I got, Mr. Chair.
Representative Lewick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I remember right, Mr. White, quite some time ago, you came up and visited a young fellow that had a sheep operation up by McGregor. Just to lay the point out here, you know, that young fella got rid of that entire flock. And he did that because it wasn't bad enough that he had his sheep killed. They finally killed his sheepdogs, and he finally threw in the towel. Those sheepdogs way back then were worth $2,000 a piece. Even though Mr. White spends a lot of time down there in the building, he's actually been out and seen this firsthand. And there's a concern that under state rules, we've been able to do preventative policing, when you know your livestock are being stalked, you could do something about it. We're back to a point where you can't do that anymore now legally under the federal rules. But again, maybe Mr. White could give us a quick rendition of some of the strangest claims you've paid. I know chickens and ducks, but just a quick run-through of the types of claims, because I think almost everything we've got out there has been killed by a wolf at least once. Thank you.
Mr. White?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lewick, you're right. Received claims, the whole spectrum of livestock, from chickens and turkeys to sheep to farmed cervidae, deer, bison, and elk. Any livestock on pasture is vulnerable to wolf attack if there's wolves in the area. And that's, I believe, why the legislature in 1977 started the program.
Thank you, Mr. White. Any other questions? Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Okay, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members.
Thanks for helping us out today.
Absolutely.
Next, we're going to have Dr. David Meach. Thank you, Dr. Meach. Thank you for coming in today. I hope we have our technical difficulties taken care of.
I hope so, too. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Dave Meach. I'm a senior research scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey. And that means I need to clarify your program where I'm listed as with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's important because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the agency in charge of the Endangered Species Act and the delisting and that type of thing. I cannot really speak with authority on that. I am a wildlife research biologist and I study wolves, and I have been studying them for about 56 years, 57 now, I guess, anyway. So I was asked to do a PowerPoint presentation, kind of an overview of the wolf situation in Minnesota. And I presume you can all see it. I can.
Not yet.
Nope, not as good, sir.
Okay.
We do have a handout.
Yeah, will it be?
I'll catch up to you.
Okay.
All committee members should have this.
Yes, and my friend here, the technician, is working on getting it up on the screen. So if you want to refer to your handouts.
Just work from that for now.
Sorry?
We'll just work from the handout for now. Please proceed.
Yes.
We'll work
okay.
from the handout.
Right. So we're talking about the timber wolf as compared to the brush wolf, which is really a coyote. And the wolves in Minnesota prey primarily on white-tailed deer, but they also, wherever there's moose, there's also wolves, and they're preying on the moose as well, and on beavers, and actually, as you heard, on just about any other creature that lives there, but they live primarily on deer in Minnesota. They also live on livestock, as you've heard as well, and that's sheep and cattle and pigs and horses, etc. And they also kill dogs, and which is a very quite a problem in some rural areas when your pet dog is killed. Because of this kind of negative behavior on the part of wolves, they were actually wiped out of all of the 48 contiguous states by the late 1960s, except for Minnesota, where because our wilderness was contiguous with Canada, and because the wilderness was basically inaccessible in some areas, poison was not able to be distributed in those places, and wolves survived. And so after wolves were exterminated from most of the 48 states, except Minnesota and Isle Royale, Michigan, out in Lake Superior, they were placed on the endangered species list in the late 60s and were protected by the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which took effect in August of 1974. So that's when the wolf became federally protected in Minnesota. And at the same time, the federal government, that is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, set up a wolf recovery team, which was supposed to develop a wolf recovery plan, which it did, and the first plan was approved in 1978. That plan had the provisions for delisting the wolf, for wolf recovery, the biological criteria for wolf recovery. And that was supposed to be 1,250 wolves, actually 1,251 for some reason, 1,250 wolves in Minnesota for 5 consecutive years, and at least 100 wolves in Michigan and Wisconsin combined for at least 5 consecutive years. So those were the provisions of the Federal Recovery Plan. Next, I want to show you the history of the Minnesota wolf population. That was, and it starts on the graph here in 1965. That's relevant because that's when the Minnesota legislature they threw out the bounty, which was a $35 bounty on wolves in 1965, and the wolf population began increasing. And it increased to about 1,250 in 1978 and continued to increase, as you see here on the graph, and you've heard from the DNR, to about 2,400 wolves now, plus or minus. The next slide shows what the DNR also mentioned, and that is that the actual numbers that are posted each year for the wolf population, those numbers are taken at the minimum point, basically the minimum point in the annual wolf population cycle. Now, what I mean by the wolf population cycle, which you saw momentarily here on your screen, is that come April, wolf populations basically double. Wolf populations basically double. That's because the pups are born at that time. And suddenly the population, assume you had about an average pack size of 5 or 6, and the average litter size for packs producing pups is about 6. So in April, late April, that'd be like the last week in April roughly, suddenly we have double the number of wolves that we had before. Then throughout the year, as you see, some of these wolves die off from various reasons, etc., and down into finally, again, the beginning of the year when they're counted again and we have pretty much the minimum population again. Next. And incidentally, I think we've gone too far. That slide, you need to go way back. Keep going back. Because that slide was shown twice. We want to get back to here now. Okay. Okay. So these wolves, and not only do some of them die throughout the year, but also they disperse. That is, they leave their natal packs and they run off to long distances. Some of them into as far as Missouri. And one over there went all the way over to New York State. That was one from Michigan. But anyway, so they disperse far and wide, which allows the population to expand as much as it can, because these wolves move out, they pair bond, set up a territory, and breed, produce their own packs. Next. So with this process of quick reproduction and dispersal, the wolves have increased a great deal, and as you'll see here, on the recovery criteria was 1,250 wolves in Minnesota for 5 consecutive years. We reached 1,250 in Minnesota in 1978. Current number is about 2,400. In Wisconsin and Michigan combined, the criterion was 100 wolves for 5 consecutive years. That was reached in 1994. There's currently about 1,300 wolves there. Next. And as the Minnesota DNR said, biologically then, wolves are recovered. They're recovered according to the criteria, the federal government's criteria of that demonstrated here in the wolf recovery plan. So biologically, there's no question that the wolf population has recovered. Next. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service, then, because the wolf population recovered, set up what's called a distinct population segment. That's a legal term. It doesn't really matter here what it means, but the segment was as depicted here. Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and then a dispersal area off to the west and to the south a bit, the distance that wolves could regularly disperse. That was the area that the Fish and Wildlife Service decided that the wolves should be delisted from. Next. And so the wolf was removed from the endangered species list in 2007 in this area. Next. Through a lawsuit, it was relisted in 2008, and that lawsuit was won on a legal technicality. So, next. The wolf was delisted again in April of 2009. And again, there was a lawsuit on the basis of legal technicalities. Next. And the wolf was relisted again in 2009. Next. It was delisted again in December of 2011. And through the most recent lawsuit, again based on technicalities, next, the wolf was relisted, as you know. Next. Now, when the wolf recovery team set up the wolf recovery plan, they kind of prescribed what they thought the number of wolves should be in various zones of the state. They had wilderness zones that they, as depicted here, that they prescribed about 850 wolves for. They thought that would be the level at which wolves would conflict the least with humans. And in the semi-wilderness zone, 400. And outside of that zone, 0 wolves. That was what the wolf recovery team thought and prescribed for what they thought would be the number of wolves, the optimum number of wolves that would minimize conflict with human beings. Next. But as you see here, currently, these are the numbers we have in each of those zones. So we've exceeded those in those zones. Next. Of interest is the distribution of livestock throughout the state. As you see here, each little dot on the map represents about 500 head of livestock. And the current front of the wolf range is really getting very close to where some of the most concentrated livestock areas are. And this is one reason for considerable concern on the part of ranchers and farmers. Next. Now, as you've also heard, Minnesota pays compensation for wolf depredations on livestock, and federal control agents take about 150 to 200 wolves per year that have been depredating on livestock. Next. But to put this in perspective, because it sounds kind of bad looking at it that way, and it is bad in certain areas, but to put that in perspective, this really amounts to less than 1% of all of the livestock in the wolf range. And to give you some idea of what that looks like, all these little tiny dots, all these little tiny squares that you see here, not the big ones, but the little tiny one, there's 28,000 of those in the total view. And the number of livestock killed each year out of those is in this one little dot that says represents 8. Now, there is some question about whether the livestock that are verified killed by wolves are the only ones killed. And a study down out west indicates what they did out west, this was in Idaho, they put mortality collars on calves, domestic calves, and they found out how many of those were killed by wolves. but they didn't let the rancher know how many were killed, and so they compared the number that were really killed by wolves versus the number that were discovered killed by wolves and verified. And it turns out it was about 8 times the number were really killed by wolves as what were reported. That doesn't necessarily apply directly to Minnesota because of differences in the way cattle are kept in the different areas, but it does show that wolves are killing more than what are actually able to be verified, as you've heard already. And so assuming then, next, assuming that, that there's really 8 times as many killed as are verified, this is the proportion is killed out of the total in the wolf range. So looked at that way, this is not a huge number. However, next, if you're one of the families that are involved here and your livestock are killed, it's a serious problem. So we have this serious problem, but we need to keep it in perspective. Next. Now there's also, that was the negative side of wolves. As you know, there's a number of people in Minnesota, and incidentally, this is the case throughout the world where there's wolves. There's a number of people who really revere wolves for whatever reason. I mean, wolves are charismatic animals, they're pretty and that type of thing. Pups are cute and everything. So there are a number of people, a big segment of society who really love wolves and they revere wolves and they don't want to see them killed. So this is another aspect of our wolf situation in Minnesota. I've talked about the negative aspect, while there is this positive aspect to a great number of people. Next. The Minnesota DNR, as DNRs throughout the country and in fact throughout the world where there's wolves, they need to try to balance these two types of values, the values of the people whose livestock are being killed and who are hunters who feel that the wolves are competing with them for their deer and their moose and that. DNR needs to balance catering to those folks as well as to the people who really don't want wolves killed. And the way they do this is through regulated harvesting or regulated wolf hunting and trapping. And here's some perspective on that. In Idaho, they have quotas, they have closed seasons at certain times, and the way that's done amounts to taking a certain number of wolves each year. And the number of wolves you see here in Minnesota is, at least currently, Minnesota DNR, the harvest season, the last harvest season, took about 11% of the minimum wolf population. Next. Now, this percentage is taken at a time, that percentage is of the annual count, which is taken at a time when the population is minimal, but actually the hunting is done when the population is at a higher level than the minimum. And that's important to understand as well. Next. There have been many studies done on the sustainable harvest of wolves throughout Canada and Alaska, and the studies vary, but they indicate that it depends on the population, but that you can sustainably take 28 to 53% of a wolf population each year. In areas where they really are trying to knock the wolf population down, they try, like in certain areas of Alaska or the Yukon, they take about 75% of the population each year to hold the population down. So I would just have you compare that with the number that are harvested each year in Minnesota, roughly 11%. Next. Okay, so we've identified that there are really two types of constituencies for the wolf. One's folks that really are damaged by them and really have a negative view of wolves, and those who really revere wolves and like to have them around to see, to hear, and to know they're out there. That's important even if they never see one. And so there's this polarization between the animal rights folks on one end and the consumptive users on the other. The animal rights folks tend to focus on individual animals, the value of each individual animal. The consumptive users, the hunters and ranchers and all, they focus on the population. And so you get this clash between these two constituencies. Next. And along with that clash, you get misinformation that is promulgated. On the one end, a lot of the folks who really dislike wolves, you'll often hear that they'll tell you that wolves kill for fun. kill for sport. And on the other side, you get folks saying things like wolves feed only on mice. I've heard that I don't know how many times, feed only on mice. Or wolves need the whole pack to survive. They can't survive alone, that kind of thing. This is misinformation, and we've all heard it, and it goes on and on and on. Next. And because of that, we actually set up the International Wolf Center, which the goal is to try to foster scientifically based objective information about the wolf so as to try to bring some measure of rationality to wolf management because of the polarization of the constituencies. Next. And the wolf does have this other positive value. It did, a study in 1996 by the University of Minnesota showed that the Wolf Center in Ely, Minnesota, boosted the local economy by about $3 million. So it has that positive value as well as a negative value. And the Minnesota DNR is caught in between because they have to manage the wolves for both these constituencies. Next. Okay, in closing, I just wanted to kind of review with you the criteria that the Fish and Wildlife Service legally has to consider when they list a species or they delist a species. They have 5 factors legally they have to consider. One is the damage to or destruction of a species habitat. Well, does that apply to the wolf in Minnesota? Have we damaged the habitat so much that the wolf is endangered? Next. No, there is not that kind of damage. Okay, what about overutilization of the species? Next. No. Is the species threatened by disease or predation? Next. No. Is there inadequacy of existing protection? Next. No. There are other natural or man-made factors that affect the continued existence of the species? Next. None. So legally, from the standpoint of the factors that the Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal government, has to consider, the wolf in Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Michigan for that matter, none of those factors apply. That is, the wolf is safe as far as all these factors are concerned. And that's why the Fish and Wildlife Service delisted the wolves. But what's happened is that the Endangered Species Act is a very complicated act, and if you don't cross the T's and dot the I's and take care of all the legalities in that act when you're delisting, and if there is a constituency who wants that species protected and they sue, then they win. And they've won all of these cases because of these legal technicalities. So as far as all these factors are concerned, next, it's irrelevant to the judge who has to look at the actual wording of the Endangered Species Act and what's actually happening on the ground. And next, I'll be open to questions if you have any.
Dr. Meach, just to clarify, who do you work for? And
I work for the U.S. Geological Survey.
there you go. Okay, members, this is the guy that knows what's going on, so I expect some questions. Representative McNamara, you had your hand up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Chairman, thanks for bringing Dr. Meach in. Dr. Meach, it's good to see you again, and thanks for being here. We really appreciate your perspective. I have 2 questions. First, I'd like to ask you, a little unrelated to Minnesota, but you mentioned the one place that we had a viable wolf population and it stayed was Isle Royale, the island, Michigan island off the coast of Minnesota. What's your thoughts on what we can do there to keep a viable population on the island of the gray wolf, not the moose? I mean, I want them both, but the moose aren't trouble.
Dr. Meach.
Mr. Chair, Representative McNamara, I believe you're asking about the survival of the wolves on Isle Royale. If I can just give some background, the wolf population there arrived in 1949. Average population per year is about 25. The population has been as high as 50, and as of last year, it was down to 8 or 9. And so the question is, should something be done to bolster that population? There is the scientists who are involved out there, I'm not anymore, but those who are think that the National Park Service, since it's a national park, should bolster the population there by importing wolves from Minnesota or Canada to try to increase the outbreeding there and all. And my personal view is that I think the science is more important than what's actually going on biologically, and I think we need to see what that population will do by itself. So I do not favor reintroducing wolves to the island.
Representative McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Dr. Meach, just from layman's understanding that the overruling or overturning of the recent judge's ruling will be difficult. If that ruling's not overturned, what will happen here in Minnesota? Will we get some? Will we have the ability to have federal trappers, or what happens if the judge's ruling's not overturned and we don't have federal legislation? What will happen in Minnesota?
Mr. Chair, Representative McNamara, the current situation is such that the federal government will be able to continue its depredation control program in Minnesota. And so they can respond to depredations on livestock. As far as the funding is concerned, that depends very much on Congress. And in recent years, the funding has been in jeopardy. So it's not clear whether that will continue. The other provision, however, that we've had in effect for the last 3 years since the delisting, that ranchers can actually shoot or kill livestock if they, wolves if they see them depredating on livestock. That provision, of course, has been overruled now. So the farmers cannot take matters into their own hands, but they can call for federal help. It's hard to say what will happen to the population, whether it'll continue to increase and expand. My guess is over a long period it would.
Thank you. Representative Van Zel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Meach, I've enjoyed your work and applaud all of your efforts over the years. All of us on the committee pay careful attention to what you have to say. I'm looking at page 2 of the DNR's handout, and I would want you to know that Metza Moline and I live in the dark gray section of the map. I kid them because they live in town and I live a click south of Effie. And obviously we have a lot of wolves and a lot of deer, ordinarily. I was wondering if you could just give us a paragraph or two of your opinions about what is the proper balance between a sustainable deer herd in northeastern Minnesota and a sustainable, viable wolf population as well.
Dr. Meach.
That would take, Mr. Chair and Representative McNamara, that would take, sorry.
Ansels is the name.
That would take more than a paragraph. Sorry, you were blocked. Anyway, generally, you know, taking an overview of the wolf deer situation, generally wolves do not compete in Minnesota with deer hunters over in a general way. But in individual areas they can and they do. But the individual areas vary by year, and it has to do with the weather conditions in those areas. So in some areas, if you get a severe winter or a series of severe winters, wolves can actually reduce the population such that it makes fewer for the hunters to kill. In areas or times when there are good conditions during winter, deer populations can rebound pretty quickly, and there are plenty for hunters and for deer. So it's so variable that it's really hard to give you a pat answer on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Representative Russo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Recently, we've been learning more about the hybrid population of coy wolves that moved down out of Canada and is actually coming back from the eastern states, and there's been some in our surrounding states. Is there any evidence of a significant population in Minnesota? And if so, would that possibly have an effect on some of the increase in livestock claims?
Dr. Meach.
Mr. Chair, Representative Uruso, I believe you're referring to wolf-coyote hybrids, is that? Yes. That is a very widespread and popular misconception. There were articles published, and I was an author on one of them in the late 90s that indicated that there was genetic evidence of the coyote in wolf genetics. But it turns out that was at the very beginning of the new field of molecular genetics, and the particular gene that was looked at was one that does not, it gets kind of complicated, it does not code for anything physical or behavioral. It does not actually code for anything in the animal. It just happens to be a part of the animal. And so when long ago, hundreds of years ago, some male wolf bred with a female coyote, the result was that the offspring had this one little gene in it of the coyote. This gene is passed on only by the females. So that female coyote gene got into the wolf population. The offspring of the wolf-coyote hybrid at that time then bred back with wolves over and over and over and over again, and so that any semblance of coyotes in that wolf was wiped out, except for this one little gene that stays there produced by that female coyote hundreds of years ago. And so even though technically you can say that there is evidence of the coyote in some of Minnesota wolves, like 60% of them or so, there is no practical or biological or physiological or behavioral part of the coyote in Minnesota wolves.
Anything further, Representative Uruso? Representative Hurtas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Meach, thank you for the information you've been providing. It's very helpful. I was wondering if you could speak to the population. I note in your presentation that we reached this sustainable recovery at 1,250 back in 1978, and that was more than 30 years ago. You also noted that the wolf population has the capacity to double every year because of that. And I also noted that there's a listing, delisting, listing, delisting. But could you talk a little bit about the correlation of that and the wolf population and why it maybe isn't 20 or 30 or 40,000 based on 30 years of reproduction?
Well, Mr. Chair, Representative, again, a very complex question, and I don't have a full answer for it. The animals that are produced each year, about 30% of the pups that are born in late April are pretty well, about 30% die by the time fall comes around. And this is from, sometimes they're trying to swim across the river and they drown, or some disease gets one or two of them. Some of them starve to death. I've seen a number of pups that starve to death. But in one way or another, they are dying off along with the adults. And some of the adults are dispersing into Canada. And we do get some dispersers from Canada as well. And then some of them are killed on the depredation control program, 100 to 200 a year. And some disperse outward to areas where we don't even know about it, like Missouri, and they are killed illegally or accidentally. And through this attrition each year, the population has been pretty stable over that period since roughly the early 2000s or so. It fluctuates somewhat, but not a huge amount once they reach a certain level. But I do really feel that if the depredation control program were not in effect, that we would see a rapid expansion of the wolf population to the west and to the south. I say that because although this hasn't been studied with peer-reviewed studies or anything, it is certainly true that the livestock depredation control program that operates primarily in May, June, July, and August ends up killing a number of the breeding females, which means that their pups essentially will be dying as well. And I think if it weren't for that, we would be seeing quite an expansion and increase in the Minnesota wolf population.
Representative Hertaus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if you could just clear up maybe a myth, you may or may not know the answer to this, but when I became a first starting deer hunter at age 13, I had an elder who explained to me that when wolf pups are born, the mother will take them to water, and that wolves don't lap water, and any pup that laps water, the mother will kill. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, I haven't studied that, sorry.
Representative Metza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Pass. My question got asked.
Okay. Dr. Meach, Representative Fabian.
Thank you.
Members, Representative Fabian's not on the committee, but I seen him in the audience, and I asked him to come join us because he lives up in the wolf country, and I knew that he was going to have some questions for Dr. Meach.
The gray area is bipartisan.
Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Meach, I'm curious to know, and I see DNR had left, but Mr. Bogus is back. I was going to ask you if you were familiar with the data that the DNR had on radio collars on moose cows and moose calves and the effect that the predators had on them.
Yes, Mr. Chair, yes, I am. I'm familiar with that.
Well, Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, if we could maybe get that information.
Well, and I'd like to know a little bit more. If you know anything about that issue, Dr. Meach, as far as moose are disappearing in the state of Minnesota, is there a connection with the wolf? And can you elaborate on what you know about that issue?
Mr. Chair, I recently published a paper that indicated that there is a fairly strong correlation between the increase in wolves in the moose area and a decrease in the calf-cow ratio. And because of that, I do believe that that is evidence that the wolf increase in that area is part of the cause of the moose decline in that area. I'd be happy to make that paper available to anyone.
We'd appreciate that, Dr. Meach.
Thank you.
Dr. Meach, I also have a question as far as the depredation program, and if there's no federal money, there's no program, if I understand it. How do we pay to have those wolves trapped, all of those things? Can you elaborate on that a little bit? If we don't have that federal funding, there's not going to be a program to handle the problem wolves, the way I understand it. If you could elaborate on that a bit.
Well, yes, the federal program, which has been in effect along with the state program during the time when the wolf population was delisted, is based on federal appropriations. And those appropriations are made every year. And in the last few years, the amount of money appropriated has been reduced. And with the uncertainties in the federal budgeting, it could be reduced further. And if it is reduced, the program would not be able to function fully. It would have to cut back the program to the extent that the budget will allow them to operate. So it could have a negative effect on the depredation control.
Which, Dr. Meach, in turn would result in an increase in the wolf population in northern Minnesota.
An increase in the wolf population and a possible increase in depredations, yes.
Thank you. Thank Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then just one other question for Department of Ag. I see they're here. They talked about unpaid claims for wolf and elk depredation. If we could get those numbers from them, how many dollars are not paid in claims through now? And if they can do a projection to the end of the fiscal year, that would be helpful.
Okay, I think the Department of Ag is still here. I'm sorry. Welcome back to the committee. Just state your name again for the record and who you represent.
Yes, Mr. Chair, Santo Cruz, Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And Mr. Chair and Representative Fabian, we will get more detailed information for you on projections. As you heard today, we certainly expect the number to increase in the spring. And this is off of, if you have the handout, the numbers that we're working off of here are for fiscal years. So the fiscal year will not end until June. And so as you heard, the packs grow in the spring, the farmers calve, and it is a time where we do see an uptick in claims. So we will consolidate that information as best we can and get a historical trend line. To some degree, you can see that in the numbers. If you look in your packet at this grid, you can see that we've had the numbers going down, then coming back up in 2010 when you started to see the increase in wolf packs around the state of Minnesota.
Further questions? Representative Cornish.
Just a couple quick ones. The first of an observation, I don't know if the wolves kill for fun, David Meach, but I had Bruce Lowe in the Funkley Pack, remember that one down there? They came in and killed 13 sheep one night and 8 parts of one. And then Jack Upton up by Mizpah had the same problem. But maybe if it's a feeding frenzy, they overkill. I couldn't say they're killing for fun, but that overkill has been a problem. But the question I had was, these people that tell us there's other methods of controlling the animals, you know, they do the taste aversion for a while. They tried the yellow flashing lights, the sounders like they have for geese. Are any of those effective overall, or what kind of luck have you had? Because we never had much luck up there, or the maintenance and the trying it.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, Representative Cornish, we tried any number of things like that, as you know, and none of them were really effective consistently. In certain times, in certain places, some things work, livestock guarding dogs, and there have been even people who tried livestock guarding llamas, and sometimes these things do work. Flagging, draping, it's called flattery, but anyway, little plastic streamers from fences every 2 feet will keep wolves away for a few weeks, that kind of thing. But no one has come up with a consistently useful technique or effective technique to reduce livestock depredations over a long period or a long time.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Oh, Representative Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this may be getting a little too far into the weeds, but at least anecdotally, an area where I live, we see this constant up and down cycle of depredation. And it would appear that it has a lot to do with the size of the pack involved. Rarely, and this is based on some, pretty firm observation, has a pack actually been eliminated in the area. But we go through this problem spring and summer. We go a couple years, and then when the trappers come in, they'll take 6, 7, 8 wolves, and then it goes away. It looks to me pretty obvious that a pack reaches a certain size and it must not be able to sustain itself on a deer. Is that just back of the envelope biology?
Dr. Meach.
Mr. Chair, Representative Lewick, no, it isn't. It's actually, that's a legitimate observation. What happens is packs build up. Then the competition within the pack for food increases a great deal, and then the dispersal rate suddenly increases. So wolves can disperse and often do between the age of about 1 year and 3 years. Now, if you have a situation where there's an adequate food supply or even a surplus of some sort, a pack can build up because the young ones that might have dispersed if there wasn't enough food at 1 year of age might stay until 2. So all of a sudden, you get 4 or 5 more wolves in the pack. And in some places like Yellowstone, where there was a surplus of prey when the wolves were first reintroduced, the packs build up to, one pack build up to 37. And, but eventually, you know, that competition gets too great, and then the maturing wolves have to leave. And all of a sudden, that pack size drops considerably. So your observations are, I think, valid.
Okay, any further questions? I do have one additional question, Dr. Meach. We hear sometimes from some folks that when we had a hunting and a trapping season in the state of Minnesota, that certain members of a pack are trapped or killed, and that's devastating to the pack. Can you tell us a little bit what you think of that situation? When one of the members of the pack is taken out, how does that affect the pack?
Yeah. Mr. Chair, it varies considerably because the membership of a pack varies considerably. A pack is a family. So you have the basic parents, and then you have offspring of, could be, well, certainly the previous year, which then we were referring to as pups, although they're pretty much adult sized by the time of hunting season. And you may well have some 2-year-olds and every now and then a 3-year-old. So depends on the pack size, but let's just say on average, kind of a rule of thumb, with maybe in the fall, average pack size, say somewhere around 8. Most of those animals are going to be young ones, non-breeders. Only 2 are going to be the breeders, the mother and the father. So just if the members were killed at random, then by chance, most of them would be young ones. And as far as the effect on the pack, it would essentially have no effect on pack numbers or the breeding history of the pack. Now, if the mother or the father is killed, then it could have some effect on the pack. However, since the hunting season and trapping season is generally in the fall and early winter, by the time breeding season comes around, which is like February really, by that time, usually some of these wolves that I mentioned that dispersed, some of them are floating around the population singly as lone wolves, and they're looking for a pack to get into. And we've watched this actually watched this happen, where the adult male or the adult female was killed, the pack continued, and then eventually if the female was killed, then eventually a female floater, we call them floaters, a female lone wolf floater will find that pack and discover that there's no adult female in there, will be adopted into that pack and then continue to breed for the pack. So generally, it does not have a huge effect. If you kill them both, if you kill both the male and the female adults, which would be rare by chance, then the pack could break up and the pups would disperse.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Dr. Meach. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Cruz, for stopping by and helping out today. Members, we do have a couple more folks that would like to testify. Mr. Tom Peterson and Doug Busselman. Mr. Peterson is with the Director of Public Affairs for Minnesota Farmers Union, and Mr. Busselman is the Director of Public Policy for the Minnesota Farm Bureau. And welcome to the committee. Who wants to go first?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. My name is Tom Peterson. I represent the Minnesota Farmers Union and appreciate you having the hearing today on this as one of our top issues for our members. I passed out a letter that Farmers Union sent on January 5th to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Interior, asking them that they appeal Judge Howell's decision. MFU believes that Minnesota has a healthy and thriving wolf population and that it does not warrant at this time their being on the endangered or threatened list. We do support and had been working with the DNR management plan and felt that it was working. This decision is very frustrating to our members who are now not able to protect their livestock and pets. And let me say they do make an effort to do that, whether it's fencing or, as mentioned, dogs. You asked about the oddest claims. I've had a member that had llamas and had 2 llamas that they got, and llamas work good, but wolves killed the llama this fall one night and came back the next night and killed the second llama. And so Always interesting, but very frustrating for those families. I live in Pine County. I have a farm in Pine County. I know what my neighbors say when they wonder when the dog barks at 3 in the morning. One of the first thoughts that a farmer has is of wolves, and it's a very large concern. We are interesting to see, what can be done and what we're working on. I mentioned that we're urging people to consider appealing the decision or inviting the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to appeal the decision. We are working with our federal delegation. I think they're looking very closely at what they can do. We've had good contact with Senator Klobuchar and Franken and Representative Peterson's office. And then also you've heard about the account today, and that's very concerning that we've run out of dollars within the depredation account that our farmers are used to using. I've also been talking with the USDA FSA about the LIP program or livestock indemnity program that farmers can use also, but it's a little different. And so we'd urge you to consider supplemental funding before we run out at the end of the year. So look forward to visiting with you in the future on this issue. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Ms. Postman, please state your name and who you represent for the record.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Doug Busselman. I'm the Director of Public Policy for Minnesota Farm Bureau. Our number one concern with this issue is that Minnesota farmers and ranchers are no longer able to protect their livestock from wolf attacks. Because they're listed as threatened in Minnesota, wolves can only be trapped or taken by the government agent if depredation of pets or livestock occurs. And as you mentioned earlier, with federal funding being what it is, this resolution of a problem is not really readily available either. I think the other thing that we have from an observation standpoint is that Minnesota has far exceeded the objectives of the recovery program. Yet that wasn't deemed good enough. Minnesota, when they had responsibility, operated a healthy and responsible management program. Again, that wasn't deemed good enough. The court reversed a ruling by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with really no basis for science and proper management. I think it's very troubling with regard to the Endangered Species Act. On page 13 of the handout that you had earlier, where they basically crossed off the listing criteria that they use for making those decisions. If you don't have rules that matter, then you don't have rules. And that's troubling with regard to not only the Endangered Species Act, but also any incentive that any private sector person would have to be cooperative in trying to recover species. Because again, if science doesn't matter, if management doesn't matter, then there's really no guarantee that you would have the ability to move forward. While much of the necessary actions need to be taken at the national level, in the courts and in Congress, Minnesota farmers and ranchers need assistance in the form of replenishing the funds that have been depleted with the Department of Agriculture programs for reimbursement of livestock loss, and this will be a priority that we will be working on this session. We also need Secretary of Interior Jewell to appeal the decision of the U.S. court and return the gray wolf to the management of the state. Perhaps a resolution or letters from Minnesota legislators would be appropriate, and we would encourage those kinds of things. We very much appreciate the work that's already gone forward by members who have sent encouragement in that manner. We also believe that Congress needs to act through specific attention to the same fashion that was given to wolf management in Idaho and Montana. I think we need to have, if science isn't going to matter, then we need to have a different solution. And we believe that this demonstrates that Congress needs to recognize the failures of the Endangered Species Act and what it's become in terms of a failure. With a recovery rate of less than 2%, it's clear that reform is needed. Given the fashion in which courts have replaced sound science in the entire scope of the process, and that might be in terms of listing decisions as well as we saw in this case from a delisting standpoint, ESA reform must be made not only to protect livestock in the interest of farmers and ranchers, but also in the interest of the wildlife that supposedly we're supposed to be protecting. Thank you again for your attention and your opportunity to present with you.
Thank you. Questions, members? Representative Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You made reference to a federal reimbursement program, and I was curious if you could shed a little more light on that. And I guess one of the experiences that I had a number of years ago, we had a severe drought. It's almost 10 years ago. A number of us had to liquidate cattle. We were feeding hay in July, obviously, because there was no pasture. And that federal reimbursement program for damages, we put the paperwork in July, and sometime the year following, we ended up with a check, and we weren't sure what it was for because of the time. And so I hope, what's your experience on this? And I hope it's not that same watching paint dry reimbursement program, because if it is, it just will irritate people more than it will help.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, first of all, this is a new program that came out with the last farm bill that was just adopted, so I'm not sure that we know exactly how it's going to turn out or what the experience will be. We're certainly monitoring that with our members and their experiences. The program is based on reimbursing losses at the rate of 75% of the market value that's on a national level. So it's not going to be full reimbursement, and that has its own issues.
And if I could add, Mr. Chairman, Representative Luke, I actually just spent 10, 15 minutes on the phone with the state FSA about a week ago trying to figure out more about the program, because I think that's going to be important now that when a farmer calls and finds out, you know, there is no state funding, I have to do this other program. So they have to quick know to get into the FSA office. And let me just point out, in the northern part, the FSA officers are few and far between. I think your county is combined. St. Louis County, the guy comes once a month or once a week to Duluth, covers all of St. Louis County. And so there's going to be some issues there that, and then as you referenced on the old disaster programs, are a year behind getting payments. And so we're trying to work through those. But that, you know, we're trying to push the FSA too to get out there and promote the program. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Peterson or Mr. Busselman, you did mention Congress hopefully taking some action on this. And Mr. Peterson, you mentioned that you talked to some folks. Do you know what the legislation that's coming forward says? I mean, is it working on depredation issues or funding, or is it to take the wolf off the endangered species list? What's the language that's coming forward? Do we know that at this point?
The context that we've been told in our interactions have been along the lines of what they have in the two western states that have resolved the issue in that fashion.
Okay. I understand that there's a congressman in Wisconsin that's bringing something forward, and I think that the Minnesota delegation is trying to get onto that bill. I had a conversation with Congressman Emmer, and he's trying to jump on that bill with the congressman from Wisconsin. And I think that's what Congressman Peterson is doing as well.
Yes.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and I believe we're going to see some action too from Senator Klobuchar here within the next couple of days as well. So
that's good to hear.
Yep.
Good to hear that the Minnesota delegation is taking some action on this, and hopefully we can resolve this issue quicker than probably some kind of a appeal. So any further questions? Seeing none, thank you both gentlemen for coming forward. Thank you for helping. Members, we also have in the packet from Howling with Wolves some testimonies, some statements, and a statement from the Humane Society of the United States in your packet, and also a handout from the Sandy Lake Band of Mississippi at Chippewa. They wanted to come and testify today. They were not on the agenda. We had a full agenda today, and we got everything covered. So I don't think, if you want to please take a look at those items that are also in your packet. Okay, members, seeing no further business before the committee is adjourned.